So all the big famous libraries in Oxford that obviously haven't been recently burned down, sort of reminded me that I was lucky. I used to work in and around Tottenham Court Road, which is just east of all the big University of London colleges. And if you know the roadways and the doorways well, you used to be able to walk in the back door of the British Library reading room. And of course you should. I'm doing this in the late 70s, early 80s. You should be a member to get in, but if you go through the back door, no, I all think you're coming from somewhere else. So I used to manage to get into the reading room, but of course I've got no chit to say book X is being put on desk 233. That is for me. So I sort of have to slowly wander around, just sort of a bit like sniffing the books in a new bookshop sort of thing. Yeah, just who's here. And unfortunately, I never saw anybody that I really knew as a writer. No doubt there was somebody. But it's such a space. And of course, the library's moved up the road to Euston St Pancras now, in a nice new red brick building, as opposed to a grey Portland stone. It doesn't have a reading room. Quite the same. Certainly, it doesn't have one with such grandeur. Can't complain because the firm I work for built the new one. So, and every time I get a chance to, we're going to do this, and we're doing a library alongside or whatever. Yeah, okay, yeah, no problem. Sort of knock a bit off to get the job to make sure we do it. So I've done the LSE, I've done one in Cambridge, I've done one in Bristol. I didn't do the new one here, but there's got a new National Library here in Dubai. I don't know what the old one was like, but there were lots of public libraries, and it was my first non-hotel type, non-shop building that I went into. And it was across the road from where my UK bank used to be. And of course, I went in there like in the first month that I was here, didn't think. So I went in the first door. It's a segregated building. I went in the ladies' side.
Oh, wow.
And it's like, I'm not looking for women are right and men go on the left type toilet type signs. So I didn't think to look. Right. And it's lunchtime, it's blazing hot, sunshine glaring away off the white stone of the building. So I just sort of eyes down and just stormed in the first door. Turned out to be a ladies' door. So I got all the way into the return book, exit bookstone counter, and they're all waving their fingers at me and sending me out. I'm thinking, fuck off. No, it's a public library. I'm allowed in. You're in the ladies' half, sir. Oh, okay. And it's, oddly enough, a few years later, I was in Saudi, and they were dragging me in to the ladies' half of the coffee shops at prayer time, so that I could carry on reading and drinking the coffee, as opposed to, in theory, stop. Because in Saudi, you everything. If you're halfway through filling up a tank of petrol, tough luck. Prayer time, power goes off, pump stops. You have to wait. And it's like that with the public, particularly the small shops. The big ones will allow the clearly the non-Muslim to carry on filling their carts, but the counter, all the checkouts just close. Door shuts, locks. You're either in or you're out. No change. So try not to. And it's only 10 minutes. So Mark's back.
Yep, looks like Mark's back. Hello again.
Yep.
Can you hear us now? Okay. Um,
Yes.
so yeah, so theoretically I will be gone next Saturday. I'll be in the Boundary Waters, and we'll be
Mobile Wi-Fi would work just as well, surely.
I'm not bringing my watch. I'm not bringing my cell phone. It's kind of weird because yeah, and I think even if I brought the cell phone to take pictures with, which I'm not going to do, we'd be out of range. I don't think they have. I mean, I think you have to bring a sat phone up there, which we're not going to. A little bit concerned because it's three 60-year-olds and a couple of teenagers going. So it is possible that we might have some trouble, but
So,
I guess we're going to live dangerously, which is like we used to live in the days before we all were carrying cell phones in our pockets.
I was one of my last long-term employments. I was normally sat opposite an ex-merchant seaman, and he had something like 15,000 unanswered emails on his email system, right? And it was like you couldn't get him to answer an email, right? And but he seemed to function right, and his answer was, "But Captain Cook never had email."
Right.
And he still managed to. I said, "Yeah, but he got himself killed on an island, which he should have done." But yeah,
But
it,
your argument implies that had he had email, he would have been forewarned, which is not necessarily true.
Doesn't
but he might also not have been on the beach at the time. He might have been answering email, not
Oh,
safely on the
maybe,
boat.
maybe, and all the natives might have been checking their Instagrams or their
Yeah,
TikToks.
absolutely.
don't you have an Apple? You have an Apple phone?
Yeah.
Doesn't that have some kind of satellite emergency capabilities now?
Oh, I don't even know. I hadn't I
I
hadn't
think
heard
it
about that.
does.
Oh wow.
If you have a recent one, I would look into that. It would be nice to have that,
Yeah.
something for an emergency.
Yeah, yeah.
So
It
look that
would.
up.
We get phone reception here, full stop,
Yeah.
all the way to the Saudi border.
Yeah.
So you're like 200 miles out in the desert. You still got phone signal.
Yeah. Yeah. That's pretty good.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Mark was, oh no, Patrick was mentioning, and Mark, you responded to what Patrick said about talking about and maybe thinking about how we use Obsidian more. I really enjoyed those Gutenberg photographs, by the way. I was just looking at them.
Oh, thanks.
Um,
We were. That's where I was last year in the fall just before I got COVID.
mm,
We don't know those river cruises, and
mm,
there's stop in Mance, if that's the way you pronounce it, and that's where the Gutenberg Museum is. And so we went through that, um, and they had a demonstration. So it actually talks about. I'm confused now because I'm reading this book called the Gutenberg Parentheses. I think that's what it's called, which
mm,
is very good actually, and it is so much. It's a little mystifying sometimes because I forget which one I'm reading, the one we're reading or that one, because
mm,
it goes through so much of the same
right.
kind of ideas. In fact, the notion of the parentheses, it's not the author's concept, but it's somebody else claiming that you have the pre-print period historically, and now you have that with technology a kind of post-print period that shares a lot of commonalities,
Mm-hmm.
including like an emphasis on conversation rather than reading, for example.
Mm,
That's the concept of the parenthesis. But anyway, the other book overlaps a lot, and so anyway, so I because I kind of flashed back on my time in the museum, I thought I'd
mm-hmm.
post a couple of pictures. Yeah. The thing I didn't quite know what to make of Pat's comment. He obviously had either previous experiences or an understanding with his book club that it was going to use Obsidian in a different way or more, or it had changed.
Well,
And
yeah, I think
because
if
I
you
came
go,
in because I came in midstream, after what, the third book or something like that, I was asking, well, what were the expectations? And that's what prompted my
yeah.
email to you.
Yeah, I think the thing that we were doing way back at the beginning with the Dawn of Everything, and then I mean we read the Dawn of Everything first, and then we read How to Take Smart Notes, and we were spending a lot of time sort of demoing the ways that we did notes, and putting up. I was actually doing the note making in my own vault, but then I was sort of cut and pasting it into, so that there would be an example. And other people were doing things, actually right in, we're sort of, Chris, you put a lot of content in, and other people, Lewis, and a bunch of folk, kind of did, show the different ways that they kind of interacted with text and stuff. And so that was interesting. I think we have kind of gotten away from it a little bit. I've been finding, value in the things that people are putting up in the community forum. I guess, and for a while there, maybe it's my fault because I had sort of gotten away from using Obsidian a little bit, and now I'm, kind of more back to Obsidian, and because Scrintl just doesn't seem to have been, doesn't seem to be making progress, and and then apparently, I don't know, I haven't really read through all of what Nick wrote about Evernote, but apparently that's like the end of the line for Evernote. I think that sounds like they lost their last bunch of employees. So, and I am concerned with the idea that, I don't want to lose access. I don't want to invest a lot of time, putting something into a tool and then finding. I mean, I had that experience with with Tinderbox, not so much because it doesn't exist anymore, but to some extent because I don't care to continue buying the new versions in order to have access to my previous notes, because that gets kind of pricey, and it seems, I mean, it's not an unheard of model. I mean, that's what EndNote does too, but there are open tools now, and so I think that and the other thing that does that does seem to be to have worked better for me, kind of in retrospect, having moved away from it and played with paper and with Scrintl a little bit, is the bidirectional linking in Obsidian, because what I've been doing lately, I'm sort of simultaneously working on a bunch of projects, and one of them is kind of trying to make this network map of all of the connectivity in the Gilded Age, whether it's from the conspiracy theory point of view, or from the kind of from the mainstream history, these are the great men and these are how they interacted with each other kind of view, and seeing where where there are potentially interesting connections, and as part of that, I've been reading a lot of kind of biographical stuff. Like I keep getting sucked back into Ron Chernow's book about the House of Morgan, which I had thought was sort of a, when I first read it years ago, I thought it was kind of an established author, like a kind of like a Walter Isaacson or somebody, who writes, biography after biography after biography. Apparently this was his first book.
Yeah, I think, yeah.
Which, it kind of strikes me as odd. So that sort of changed a little bit, changed my, my kind of perspective on his take. But, what I've been doing is I've been sort of mining it for names and connections, and kind of documenting that. And so what I'm hoping is gonna come out of the graph views, especially the local graph view with the degrees of connection, is there are these stories about particular family units, especially in the Gilded Age, right? Like the Roosevelts or the Rockefellers or the Vanderbilts or the Morgans or whatever. But to kind of see how they interact, and where they connect, and kind of what the especially and in a lot of cases the connections are not what I would expect and are a little bit surprising. So so I'm hoping that technical capability will open up some opportunities to see connections that I would not have anticipated.
But in that context, then within Obsidian, you can given we're now not saying every atomic note becomes a blob on the graph that is of interest. And I've always said, as nice as it is to watch the time lapse of it, let me index all your notes and show you the blobby
Right.
verse.
Right, and watch them graph build, yeah.
Yeah, and watch this amoeba stroke petri dish thing grow. If you go through and tag all those atomic notes that you've made that are the ones that record the connection, which may or may not have a date, which may or may not have a location, and may or may not have a topic for that connection.
Mm-hmm.
But if you for all of those, you then go through and say, I'm going to use tag, connection or a whatever single word rather than double word you want to make.
Mm-hmm.
You can obviously filter your graph by that word, and it would show you what you think you're looking for, I think, quite easily.
Mm-hmm.
I still haven't bothered yet to play with Canvas to see how it would work backwards from text into a more pictorial view.
I haven't really either, yeah.
But seeing as you mentioned Scrintl, you would get a Scrintl type view if you didn't have to build it directly, as opposed to let us build you a. And I'm sure if you can't use Canvas for it, you could probably use Excalibur or similar, because they're much more interactive. But you would need to make sure you got your metadata right.
Mm-hmm.
And
well, which was one of the reasons that I didn't do it in the first place, was because I didn't want to actually figure out how to use data view before I used Excalibur or whatever.
Yeah. But the other thing that I've started to do is use Alias to create me a time block. If I say this happened on the 4th of August 1966, as in England won the World Cup or whatever it was when we did it in 66. That because that date is inside 1966, it's in a date alias 1960 through to 1969. And so if I then want, well, what else happened about that time?
Mm-hmm.
Because about that time is difficult to write in not so much a skeleton, but in a data view. I don't need to. All I need to do is show me the tag for 1960s, and I get a 10-year block. Given that, if we're looking at this book, we're going from like whatever that first library was, 2,500 BC to now. The decade is neither here nor there, really. So it's quite a fine-tooth comb. And it's once you start picking up on the fact that this thing is in the same decade, yes, because it's an absolute, something that happens on the 2nd of January 1970 skips, but is unfortunately valid in the about period.
Well, that's always the challenge, the problem, the argument about periodization.
And it's like, how much of what is happening now in the UK has absolutely nothing to do with Elizabeth II versus Charles III is a similar problem, right? But
well, as also is that, you mentioned, kind of what Winchester is doing with, starting, 2000, 2500 BC, and then kind of coming to the present there, and I've had similar sort of challenges with, like my modern world history, right? Starting in, the 1350s or something with the plague, and then, trying to come to the present. The density at the scale and the density varies, right, as you kind of go through that timeline, right? So there are some things where the events are going to be spaced far apart, and it makes sense to talk about it in terms of, okay, in this century, this range of things happened. You'd have a chapter that was about a century. But then when you get closer to the present, I mean, then definitely you're in decades, right? Because there's so much going on that you need to talk about. So so when you're constructing not so much the data that it's coming from, the notes that it's coming from, but the output, you have to sort of concern yourself with, how is this going to be, is the narrative going to have something to do with time, or does time compress as you move forward, or does it expand, or, or whatever?
There's elements of, once I understood some of the picturization we used in geology for time and for explanation of evolution within a geological context rather than a pure biological one. That expansion of the amount of information and the expansion of the species number and the genus number, etc., it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And of course, at that point when I was doing that first time round, I didn't realize that some of that expansion was scientists are going back and saying this one genus is now 2 as well, right? Because they've got a finer tooth comb as well. And it didn't take long to sort of suddenly figure it out. There's those elements of how do you put that on a picture? Because if you just put a simple list, you can't see that. Right. But you can see it on a growing tree of life. And then, of course, because the tree of life is so hierarchical, and we end up with the religious position of humans at the top and amoebas at the bottom. Yet, humans are basically just a mechanism of taking somebody else's DNA around and pooping it around with different food. If you took that point of view, you've got a slightly different point of view of genetic mathematics. But clearly the number of ways of being able to describe it. And although I've said about decades, of course, you could, if you've got a particular family, as you've been speaking about, it's relatively very easy to go through and say, I've already got this event inside an alias called a decade. It's not that difficult to collect a few of those decades and put them into a person who was active at a particular, so since we mentioned Elizabeth II, she's ruled from 53, 55, whatever it was, to 2022. That's a set of decades. So it's very easy without actually having to go through and say, this is Elizabeth II period on every note. Set your radiuses up, and it's like, hang on a minute, this is such a simple thing that most users of Obsidian are not particularly talking about, yet even without doing a lot of manipulation at data view end, the alias thing is so powerful.
Yeah.
Yet you can't. It's not set upable even in something like Evernote. There's no equivalent. Notion, I don't know, but I don't think they've got an alias function. Although you probably could do it because it's a database, as opposed to a text collection like Evernote.
Well, you could probably create a tag that was based on a query or something like that. Yeah.
You possibly could, but I don't think. I'm not sure what happens when you get like your Evernote database is now 25,000 notes and 8,000 saved searches or whatever.
Well,
whether it collapses under the weight.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of, philosophically too. I mean, I think we talked about this a couple of weeks ago when we were sort of talking about it matters a lot what you focus on, right? That, that sort of that there's a whole lot going on that we're ignoring, and these are the things we're focusing on, and so we've sort of oriented ourselves around these. So if we were, in your sort of biology, geology kind of example, if we're focused on life, right, then there are times when the tree, that tree of life, branches explosively, like in the Cambrian explosion, right? So you could say, oh, nothing happens for a billion years, and then we have this event where a lot is happening because, while a lot might have been happening geologically or whatever, it wasn't the stuff we were interested in, so we're not paying attention. And then you get the Permian extinction, and and it collapses, but that's somewhat arbitrary based on the fact that we've identified, life as the focal, topic, right? So, so I think that's
and similarly, Mark Bassin, and colleagues of his are all down as being geologists, paleontologists, climatologists, wanting to now put in the next divide somewhere, and they can't quite make up their mind whether they do it at Nagasaki, Hiroshima, or whether they put it somewhere in the James Watt lifetime, or something.
Oh, for the beginning of the Anthropocene?
For the Anthropocene, yeah, because it's now clearly something different. But again, the rocks don't care. But the rocks semi-cared when we had, the dinosaur collapse. There's a band, that's how we found it, wasn't it? There's a band of iridium that was so much bigger than everything else, but we needed a chemist and his dad and a geologist to put themselves out, go look, and then we found it. So is the defining tipping point something that you can predefine before it actually happens, or is it something that historians are always going to be the people to do in some form of historian? Paleontologist is an historian in some respects, as opposed to a zoologist sort of thing.
Well, it would have to do really with a tipping point. I mean, it sort of begs the question: a tipping point in what? Right? It has to be something that you're already, that your paradigm already sort of recognizes as significant, right? It would be like like we're very focused on, sort of tipping points of atmospheric carbon or something like that, right? But it's arguable that that there may be other processes leading to a temperature effect that we don't recognize yet. Yeah.
A good example for this, and he talks about it in the book Maps of Time. David Christian looks at historians who study, let's say, a decade, or historians who study a century, and then compares it to himself, who looks at kind of that idea of big history of what happens when we look at 13.9 billion years.
Right.
And then and he identifies over that 13.9 billion years, I think it's 8 big changes that are accelerating over time. So there's huge swaths of dead time, and then something happens in the world, the universe shifts in a sense. But it's also still, even from his perspective, it's a very human-centered set of shifts. And so things shift more rapidly once humans show up on the scene, because that's what he's looking at in his version of big history. But he actually does a little bit of discussion about what are the time horizons that you tend to look at as a person, or even in specific to this book, what are you kind of pre-programmed to see and notice? So when I look at this continuum of intellectual history that we're all broadly looking at, Simon Winchester, puts his finger down on July 1945 and pivots everything around Vannevar Bush. I personally think is the wrong thing to put your finger on as the pivot point. But I think he's choosing that pivot point because so many others point back to Vannevar Bush as here's the spot. And my guess is he picks it up from essentially that Tools for Thought space with and I'm going to forget his name. But he looked back at all of this history, and he kind of puts his finger on, or tends to accumulate most of the switch and the change around the time of Ted Nelson and Doug Engelbart, and those three happening roughly within the same decade. And they totally ignore what's been happening culturally and traditionally with things like index cards that we have, everyone has broadly forgotten about. And even us who are mired in a little of the recent history of this completely forget. So I think people like Marcus Krzyzewski or even Ann Blair do a better job of saying, no, it's not a pivot point here, it's a continuum. In fact, even in chapter 2, I think Winchester uses the phrase commonplace literally in that same section where he's talking about Vannevar Bush, but he uses commonplace in a dramatically different framing. He's not talking about commonplace books. He's talking about commonplace like in everyday life. And to me, the level of irony within that paragraph was stupidly high, because he's used the word and put his thumb on the thing, like it's the thing we're talking about, but then he's looking somewhere totally else.
Like Gramsci's common sense versus common sense. My sense was that he picked Vannevar Bush because you've got Engelbart and you've got Ted Nelson, who are clearly computer guys. They're sort of proto, Silicon Valley geek. And then you've got von Neumann, who is academia, right? And so Vannevar Bush kind of is a pivot in the sense that he stands between those two worlds. but also, kind of ironically, he's the DARPA connection.
I'm not sure
right?
I understand.
Sorry, my watch is listening. He's kind of the DARPA.
It happened when you said DARPA too, so be
it
careful.
did, yeah.
What I find hilarious too, and I don't know if anyone caught it, but a couple months back, I was digging through copies of original magazines trying to track down some early history. And so I was looking through like 1900-ish to 1906 copies of what today is now has been renamed as Bloomberg Business News. But it was the magazine that was the precursor to that. And I found a physical product that was being sold called the Mem Index. And it literally was a little card index with cards for every day of the year with little tabs that had that day's date on it. And so you were supposed to carry like a week or two's worth in your vest pocket, which will give you an idea how old this system was, that people still wore vests.
Mm.
And they literally said vest pocket in several of the ads, which I thought was a great. But if you needed to do something next Wednesday, you would pull out next Wednesday's card and write the little reminder down to do that thing then, and then you put it back in your pocket and go on with your day. But it was like a little, you walk around with a little index card for each day for the next week or two with your to-do list or your appointments. And that was, but then you would put them into a physical box that you kept on your desktop as a way of keeping these. And the chance is highly likely that within a stone's throw of Vannevar Bush, this thing was sold from 1903 well into the late 50s. Someone within a stone's throw of Vannevar Bush had one of these on their desk. I nearly guarantee it.
Sure.
And they were ubiquitous. There were ads galore in all of these business magazines. So if you were a business person, certainly you were using something like this. And the way the system was described, almost exact precursor of getting things done, bullet journaling, Hawk Sugano's pile of index card method, all of these productivity things that we talk about now. This encapsulates almost every single one of those principles, including it would have been an early version of like Daytimer or Franklin Covey's stuff.
Yeah.
But it was a product. They weren't selling you so much the method as they were, here's the box we're selling you, here's the dated cards, and like a 2 or 3 page booklet that explains, for those of you who, once you've been given this thing, you don't know how to use it. Like here's what you would do.
Right.
But the fact that it was called a Mem Index.
Yeah.
For 45 years before Vannevar Bush says, and it almost as a throwaway sentence, for lack of a better name, let's call it a Memex.
Oh, Memex, like, what the hell? Yeah.
Like, are you serious? Like, but he did everyone such a horrible disservice by not mentioning any prior history of anything. And maybe he did not know, and maybe it was, so in the zeitgeist of his time that he just like, if everything in your world is a wheel, you suddenly inventing the automobile, like your world is full of wheels, it's full of horse carriages, it's full of engines. It's not a stupid big jump to say, here's the automobile, let's put these 4 things together. So he did us a horrible disservice by not using the word commonplace book in that article. Like, I still, it befuddles me that he literally wipes away this message, and then everybody spends all this time reinventing all these prior wheels. The same way the building a second brain and tools for thought space in the last 5 years has been rebuilding all of these older traditions or trying to reinvent them.
Yeah.
Without any knowledge of them. It's like, hey, yeah, Luhmann invented the Zettelkasten. And I didn't, no, we've been doing this for a long time, people.
Yeah.
Like, it may be new to you, but it's not a new thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think there's an element of, sort of wanting to elbow out, sort of your own space, and I see that in the arguments over terminology and stuff now. But, especially the military was, I think was very much about these sort of systems of control that they gleaned from other places, right? But this ability to sort of create structures and then name them and then say, well, these are special because they're part of this, this kind of military culture and stuff. One of the things that struck me as interesting, just going back to Obsidian briefly, was kind of that idea that I was really focused on in really last summer and into the fall about output, right? And the ways that that some of this stuff, if you don't see, and I guess this applies to what you're saying too right now, Chris, is if you don't see those connections, it seems like some of this output is unique and it kind of creates an alternate history. Like I've been actually sort of digging in. I've been thinking about who I'm going to read on Substack and stuff like that. And a lot of the people who are coming up, are sort of involved in kind of creating alternate histories. And I'm interested in sort of challenging master narratives of history. But some of these things that I'm seeing are just really weird. Like I've sort of been following this trail of interest in what they call the American system, the American economic system, which comes up. It's associated with this guy, Henry Charles Carey, who's an economist and friend of Abraham Lincoln. So it sort of is implemented during the Lincoln administration. It's kind of what I think of, I guess, as sort of the Whiggish element of the early Republican Party. And it results, but it's being used by these people who I'm finding on Substack who are working for China in a very obvious kind of way, right? And trying to, and they've got these, these think tanks that are reimagining, especially Western history in a way that, that is more open, they say, and stuff. But what it's really, it seems to be all about underneath is sort of justifying Chinese expansion as being more in line with this this very weird kind of, they've connected dots of this tradition from Benjamin Franklin, I think anti-Hamilton, and that Hamilton was the bad guy in this story, to this weird set of connections of people that ultimately sort of kind of normalize or create this argument that that the new Chinese economic worldview, and especially the Belt and Road system, is a continuation of this, right? So they, for example, they're big advocates of, like McKinley's a hero, right? And tariffs are a good thing in this story. And so it's kind of weird. I mean, it just strikes me as very weird that these dots can get connected in this way. And if you're going from a, sort of a database like this that has these atomic things, that then the ways that you connect them, can ignore things like what you're talking about, Chris, that well, wait a minute, I've just created this story. The cat is gets not so interested in Henry Charles Carey, who wrote extensively. It's like you'd have to spend a lot of time kind of reading his stuff to understand him. And apparently he wasn't easy to read. So I'm sort of a little bit scared to go there. But to get to, maybe I'm spending too much time on that. The thing that struck me about these two chapters was it was sort of books versus newspapers. Right. And that kind of led me to wonder a little bit about, sort of expense versus markets, right? Because a lot of the people who get prosecuted in the early years, both for under blasphemy laws and under libel laws in England and America, really the reasons that they're targeted is not that they're saying they are saying things that are obnoxious, but elite publications in London, for example, say many of the same things, but they say them for more elite audiences. And so there's a kind of a history of people getting prosecuted who publish cheap editions of Thomas Paine, right? Or publish cheap, or publish newspapers that are less than like 6 pence. And so this penny press becomes kind of a focus of enforcement where where these bigger and much more expensive and much more elite oriented papers are not. And so which kind of drew my attention to that whole question of what is a newspaper of record. So there's an element of kind of controversy. There's probably also an element of sort of the ephemeral nature of how long are these these communications supposed to last? How long are they supposed to be relevant? Which probably has some resonance for the web and for things like
there's elements of that going back with particularly say like the Catholic Church is as in the Bible is in Latin. You need the priest to read it for you.
Right.
And that's a lot of where particularly the English Protestants drove from, as opposed to the German, the Swiss or the Dutch. Because and many of the Protestant martyrs from Henry VII's time, Henry VIII's time, and even Elizabeth Mary were a bit like the Al Capone issue of we couldn't get him for murder and bootlegging, but we could get him for tax fraud.
Right.
What they were doing was getting the people because you have a Bible, you have 6 Bibles in your pocket and they're in English.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the one where, particularly when I moved here, I took several months to move here. So when, on the flights that I went home and picked up some more stuff and back to the UK and came here, half my luggage weight would be books. And it was like, I'm getting stopped every time. You've got books. Yes. What? Oh, maths, politics, science, fiction. And it's like, and clearly looking at the picture of the X-ray, and it's like, and very few of them are similar shape and size until you end up with things like the Martin Beck series, for instance, which I got from one publisher, all 10 books, because when you put them on the shelf, it spells Martin Beck as well as, right? And it's like they're almost all exactly the same number of pages as well, because they're done, like you say, they're almost the same as Dickens doing, the monthly or the quarterly publication of the next novel. so it's about the same number of pages. It's printed on the same sort of paper. And for whatever reason, they always believed it. So they never actually checked. And the only time they did check was, you've got bullets, which was why you passed bullets. So I'm getting off a plane, coming into Dubai, right? And they check the hand luggage again as you come through, and you've got bullets. So and it's like, I'm pretty sure I haven't, but there's always a possibility that somebody's dropped something into your luggage, right? So I sort of leaned over to see the X-ray picture, which they didn't object to, which I thought was strange. So when I saw what they were pointing at, okay. So I unzipped the bag and brought out 3 metal-based Mont Blanc pens. And they just happened to be the non-nib end, because obviously the cover, the cover cap is on the nib, and what's left looks, from a metal only point of view, I said, and it wouldn't do very well. It's only aluminium. It's not a brass and steel stroke lead, and it's certainly not it's not for my very small GAU 8 that sits on a in playlist. Joint little laugh, and I carried on.
I was trying to find page 155, what you were talking about, Chris, and it looks like it's probably different in my book, because my 155 seems.
It's in the physical book. It's page 155. It's it's maybe the 1 or 2 pages after the beginning of section 10. I think.
William Cobbett, the Vulgar class.
So he's essentially, they're talking about, we have these museums, but who are the museums for? Are they for the rich elites who know how to appreciate what we have collected, or are they for the lower middle classes who would come through and not understand or appreciate what they're looking at, or not know or not have the context or the education to appreciate what's going on? And I thought it actually was pretty funny that the lawyers, clerks, and novel readers, who I would read as maybe middle or upper middle class, like if you can actually read and you're participating at that level, you're still not considered elite enough to be showing up, much less the riffraff who probably would be going to the pubs on museum days instead of going to the museums. That kind of riffraff you definitely don't want in your museum. But I wish he did a better job here talking about or kind of any of these historians who talk about this, and we've even got Kuhn's idea of scientific revolutions in different stages. We're always awash in too much information and information overload. So it's, how do you extract from something like this type of book some base knowledge of a general area, and then you compact it into a simpler story that you can know and understand what's going on in a certain area. And you may talk to somebody at the grocery store next week and say, hey, I'm reading Simon Winchester's book and it's about this, and you may say 2 sentences of what it's about, but you're going to encapsulate 300 pages of not super dense material, but reasonably dense history into 2 or 3 sentences. And that suddenly then is the story that you've gotten from all this reading you've done. And then you'll go on and read 10 other books that you'll do the same thing to. but broadly, you're going to take those couple of sentences from 5 or 6 different books, and you may then mash those into some new thing.
Yeah.
Or let's say all of mathematical knowledge now. In the early 1900s, most mathematicians consider David Hilbert to be the last mathematician who knew all of extant math for his day. And if you're a modern mathematician, there's now so much math to know, you can't possibly be an expert in all of it. So even someone like Terence Tao, who knows many areas of math and knows them very well, is an expert in 3 or 4 sub areas. And he knows a lot of other math, and he knows way more math than the average person walking on the street. But there are things he doesn't know and doesn't grasp at the highest levels in other areas.
Yeah. It's interesting that I think the idea in that moment that you called attention, where Henry Ellis, I guess, was the chief librarian of the British Museum, was complaining about the novel readers and the lawyers' clerks, and then William Cobbett says the museum is a place for the amusement of the curious and the rich, and both kind of focusing on the class element. I mean, there is kind of an issue of the role of museums, sort of being to public history and just sort of museums in general being ways of acquainting people with ideas without requiring them to go through the entire educational process that an academic person would, right? So there's an assumption that there's some value to that. But also there's an interesting historical moment that's happening here too, as people in London at this time, and and probably in the United States as well, for the first time we're getting this group of people who are not a middle class that is sort of this narrow layer just beneath the landed wealth of people who own capital, right? That's the original middle class of England, right? Is the capitalists who just didn't have landed titles and stuff, and so but they got to be so rich that something had to be done to include them politically. But a literate poor, right? Because lawyers' clerks don't make shit in Victorian London. Right. I mean, Charles Bradlaugh's a character who I've read a lot, and researched a lot about. And his dad was a lawyer's clerk, and he made, I can't remember exactly what he made, but
Bob Cratchit.
It was Bob. Yeah, it was like Bob Cratchit kind of a level of wages, and and really just enough to not own his own home, but basically have his own what do you call it? I mean, attached. Have a row house, that he rented, that was just for his, for his family, that he wasn't sharing, it wasn't a tenement. But he had to live all the way up in East London off of Commercial Road, in order to, and make his way down to the City of London every day, in order to do his job.
Yeah. But it's highlighted for me because within a 4-mile radius of my house, there is the Huntington Gardens and Library, formerly the grounds of Henry Huntington's massive empire, and is literally his estate home, appropriated from indigenous Southern Californians, by the way. Yeah. And in the other direction from me, there is the Museum of the Bunny, which is a collection of a lot of rabbit crazy. And it literally is just a collection I'm imagining, I think one, maybe two curators. And this museum is it's crazy pants, but it's a lot of rabbits. And I imagine that people may see it, but they come from Peoria, they come visit, and they go home and they're like, oh, I have these 5 old rabbit things that I don't want anymore. I'm going to mail them to this museum and make the collection better.
Yeah.
with my bunny rabbit ears.
Yeah.
But the difference there too is, for me, the bunny museum is just a collection, a curated selection of stuff that happens to be on display. But there's not a lot of depth. It's a mile wide, but an inch deep. Whereas the Huntington has not only a much bigger, richer, well-curated collection, but those curators are then taking things out of the collection as standalone exhibits that they're trying to tie and link pieces together to tell some type of story. Coherent, sometimes less coherent other times. And maybe they're trying to give you some education about this tiny little subsection of this thing that they are presenting now. And they'll do that for 5 or 6 months.
Right.
But typically their curators and librarians are trying to pull out things, and they'll spend a year or two putting something together.
Right.
As a coherent. So a couple years ago, they got Octavia Butler's papers.
Right.
And they have pulled things out and created a collection from a local sci-fi writer that people should know more about in our area, which is another nice thing, is they happen to be papers indigenous to the city, or the city next door. Actually, they're in the city of San Marino, which is uber wealthy. There are no apartment buildings in the city of San Marino by law.
Oh, wow.
As the neighborhood where Octavia Butler grew up, on the north side of Pasadena, where there is a clear kind of, or was a clear, it's less clear now, but there was a clear red line, black and white line in the city. So they're trying to, even within their own space, not only tell her story, but kind of become a more inclusive space for the community. Whereas the Bunny Rabbit Museum is never going to do that. They're years away from it.
Right.
So that what are those? It's one thing to have the collection, but if you're not adding, as we know, the links between the bits of knowledge and information, you just got a pile of junk. So what can you draw out of your pile of junk?
Yeah. I've got to get to the Huntington side. I've never been there, and there is a lot of kind of Revolutionary era American stuff, as well as kind of Thomas Paine related stuff. So I really
they're particularly for that time period of early Americana.
Yeah,
like that's one of their big specialties. So when you get your I know you probably have a sabbatical coming up.
If I'm going up for tenure this fall, so if I get tenure, then the following year I will be able to go on sabbatical, assuming my university still exists, which is at this point kind of an open question. We're probably going to retrench about between 2 and 3 dozen faculty. So I may end up, by next May, I may end up transitioning to, full-time Substack and YouTube. But I just popped up a link to a Revolutionary era diary and comment. It looks kind of like a commonplace book at the Huntington.
Given with this conversation so far has been on education status stroke class, because those two things pretty much went together. The other thing I constantly bump against, and I find it mostly, unfortunately, with you tea terrorists, is a good number of the Americans I bump into here, just as much as it was when I was working pan-Europe, are obviously a self-selected group in the sense of they've got enough IQ to fill out the passport form, and they've left the continental United States. And there's still an element of I don't care about everything else type thing. And I wonder, I mean, I'm clearly lucky because my second big city, by big I mean sort of several million, right, in my lifetime, and it was like I was coming up to my 12th birthday. I had 3 weeks in Paris. Not Paris, Texas, I hasten to add. But I didn't speak French. And I was, my school, my high school said, if you speak your second language well enough, we'll permit you to do a third. And the third was French. The first foreign language was German. So we all did German. And the ones who were really good at German were allowed to do French. I wasn't that good at German, so I didn't get to do French. But a friend of mine, Craig, and I managed to argue that there were 2 empty slots on the Paris trip, and nobody wanted them. But we would have them. We'd gladly have them because obviously they're a subsidised tour, and we get to go to Paris for 3 weeks. Plus the fact most of the time you guys are going to touring as French-speaking tourists with French-speaking guides, so we get a day off. We can go anywhere we like. So while we went to Sacré-Cœur, Notre Dame, the big museums, Eiffel Tower, with the group, we also had days when they were going down on a French-speaking tour down the sewer. Okay. I know what sewers are like, even back then, you know. So Craig and I, we're going to go somewhere. And so I think on that day, we ended up going all the way out to Saint Denis and ended up, as 2 11-year-olds buying our first bottle of wine. And it's like, I don't think of it as being that special. But then when I see things for small village life in the UK even, or small village life in rural France, and it's like, I'm coming up to retirement, I'm going to make my second trip to Paris. And it's like, all right, I didn't live in London, I didn't have a London telephone number, but I was within the boundary of London, so it wasn't quite so bad. But 12 minutes on the train, and I could be walking into the British Museum, another 5 minutes or so on the Underground, and I could be walking into the V&A or the Natural History Museum, because they're adjacent with the Science Museum in between. I had such good access, and rather like we were talking a little bit before other people popped in, where I was working when I finally went working engineering-wise, I was wandering in and out of a British Museum, British Library reading room, and in theory could have gone to the reference stacks that surround that. And I wonder the other dimension. Access, however it's gained, however it's stolen, as opposed to given, how much that makes a difference. I didn't go to Oxbridge for university.
And closed stacks versus open stacks, even.
Closed stacks versus open stacks. But like the British Library as a library is like 60, 70 million volumes on shelves, and most of those shelves are 300 miles up the road in Yorkshire. Because you can't afford to build that bigger building and have public access to it in London. You know, even though what I think of as the new British Library that is now like must be close to being 50 years old, up between Paddington and King's Cross, is probably a 20 million volume stack access, and some of that's in the basement, so that's, you don't wander around as a normal member of the public. But it's always been a library that you fill in a chip for, we will bring you the book, go sit at desk number whatever, versus a normal public library.
Well, which as I understand, I've never been in the New York Public Library, but I think that is as well. I don't think their stacks are open, but I think they're very quick about getting you books.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's that big a deal. I mean, when I did the LSE library, you know, London School of Economics library, it was open access to students, and of course, then I got a temporary staff card because I was there for a couple of months. But then when I did a research lab for University of Bristol, Bristol's contract with their construction team is they want a person like me, it doesn't have to be me, but they want a person like me, has to be there for a year, a calendar year. You can do anything you like, but you must be interruptible for any issues, problems from either the building occupants or the team that looks after it. But to get you in the building, you have to have a staff card, or because it's not a student building; it's a proper staff research building. So I became a temporary member of staff. So I had better access than I did 20 odd years before at university, because the internet was around by then, to papers and all this. So I was spending an hour a day with a JSTOR and whatever it is, access to all the papers from a major university that gave me full open access to everything that sort of Nature and Scientific American and everything in between does. Yeah, great. So it's how is access arranged? How is curiosity satisfied? And you see that we haven't really touched on that element in terms of those individuals who are excluded by race or by age or by class, who are curious. What do they do to overcome that? How do they, whatever? And there's a number of instances where people were stealing access or managing to get access for a whole different range of other mechanisms. And I think that one or two people have picked up on, and I think we mentioned somewhere in the book even, about the mechanism whereby the actual data, and we've in today's conversation we've commented on it in terms of having the background to understand, or the context of the background to understand, and particularly in terms of saying, like, being able to read the Bible, make sense of it without making a heresy and all the rest of it. There's a whole range of those elements, and you have a classic one in the UK for censorship is Lady Chatterley's Lover. That wasn't publicly available in English in the normal high street bookshops till the mid-60s. Yet, if you spoke French or German and or you were going overseas, you could always get an English copy or a French copy or a German copy. A number of people that were doing that was relatively limited. And as we were saying, you're of a class of an education that allows you to recognize what you've got, and you don't treat it as though it's a titillating porno book, movie, copy of Penthouse or whatever. And yet, within a year or so of the book going out of being restricted by the Chancellor, there's a film out. I mean, that starts off as being an X-rated in the UK, R-rated in the US initially, and then it's shown on television, albeit at a late hour, but it's still shown on television.
Yeah.
We see that same kind of access question in the abortion area now. So it's, hey, let's legislate the poorest people away from access to this because of their education, their station in life, or their financial situation. But the people who are doing that legislating are rich and in a better position, and it's super easy for them. Oh, we could fly to California, or we could fly to Europe, and we'll get our abortions safely and cheaply there. But the lower classes, they don't know what they're doing, and this is a thing for us, which is actively happening. And it's that same type of weird access.
There's a them and us element.
Well, and
go ahead, Dan.
And that goes back to those prosecutions that I was talking about for a lot of things. I mean, and one of the ones that I followed very closely, of course, was Charles Knowlton was prosecuted several times for birth control, which was adjacent to abortion, for writing practical medical advice about how to do it. And in one of the actual trials, the judge admitted that, and the prosecution even kind of admitted that, this was all stuff that does appear in medical literature, right? And so the crime really that they're prosecuting Knowlton for is giving access to people, to poor people in an edition that literally was about the size of this little thing. It actually, the book was about that big. And wow. So it was something that, that was available for 50 cents that you could palm. Right. And you could hand to somebody without anybody being any the wiser. And so it was designed to be private and for regular people. And that's where the crime was.
Did you come across Benjamin Franklin's abortifacient advice while you were doing that?
I didn't. I've heard rumors about that, but nothing. I never came across anything.
There were a bunch of historians submitted an amicus brief to the decision that ended Roe, essentially. But Franklin had taken a British written piece and he took some stuff out of it. It was kind of an everyday household manual of here's how to do lots of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
He took some pieces out of it and added some pieces for an American audience. But within that was a section that had two common abortifacients of the day that were very commonplace. So he widely republished this book. If you go into my hypothesis section and pull up you search for Benjamin Franklin and abortion, you'll find the original thing.
Okay, I see something from NPR talking about a Slate article written by Molly Farrell.
But apparently he published it, and it was a wide early American, along with how to make a cake.
How to make pickles.
Pickle your pickles. Here's some daily advice that everybody should just be aware of. So I'm going to have it in this book of, and it's one of those types of books that you have your copy of the Bible and you have your copy of Dante maybe, but you need this as your, third book. Was actually how it was sold.
Yeah. I'll look at that. Thank you. Yeah, I am familiar with the whole every man his own doctor thing. And another guy, an Edinburgh physician named William Buchan, wrote a book of a family medical book that was designed to be readable and useful for regular people. And that was something that did show up in a lot of these, not only early American East Coast homes, but also, it spread westward really quickly. Cool. Thank you.
Going back 5 minutes too, I wrote a note here that shifts the topic back, but
Penny Royal water. Yeah, that's the yep. Sorry.
I noticed in the last couple of years, so there's Dan Cohen is the Dean of Libraries, I think, at Northeastern. And he started out at the Rory Rosenzweig Center 2 decades ago or more, which was kind of the hub of all the tech people in the library space.
Right.
So libraries have been undergoing this technological shift to computerization, and he's been at the forefront of a huge chunk of that. But he's also now talking about, and I think he's actually used the phrase books as wallpaper, because a lot of university libraries are, Tim said, we don't have the space, so we're going to store our books somewhere else, and if you really need them, we'll ship them back. And you can have it and have the access, and it's easy enough. But most people aren't using libraries for what they used libraries for 20 years ago, or it's all instant digital access that we're paying 2 and 3 times over again to have the digital access from a handful of publishers when we have that very same book. And it's, that's a big fight in a lot of the space now too, is you own the book. Can you not scan it and loan it out one at a time to whoever, which is the Internet Archive is fighting that fight recently.
Right.
But that idea of, or in the Zoom conversation over the last 3 years, everybody who appears as a guest on TV is sitting much as I or Dan and I presume John has a hidden stash of bookshelves behind him, even in the blur. But here's the wallpaper behind me that indicates I'm a knowledgeable, learnable
member of the club.
Instead of Mark, who takes the more natural perspective on life and has the greenery instead. But it's that how do we use this knowledge? Is it just gilded wallpaper behind us, or is it actual,
Yeah.
It comes back to the thing that Diane was talking about in terms of in the middle of our global session zone, there was this crisis of confidence is in where's the output? If you're reading and you're taking notes, with or without Obsidian, where's the output? And now, we're all reading Dan in Substack and etc. And Substack has said, "Oh, we don't want you talking about this in Twitter or Facebook. So we'll allow you to make highlights and allow you to make notes that are available publicly to Substack subscribers, which you can still be a free one to get access to those. And it's more than just a comment about the current piece you're reading from Dan. And I wonder, particularly things like with threads popping up this week as being the Twitter killer. As in, there is a clear, big user base within LinkedIn. There's a clear user base within Instagram, WhatsApp, Facebook, Twitter, etc., 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 and a growing one within Mastodon, which is not quite the same. And I'm wondering where it's going to go, because I keep thinking I've got a news aggregator that seemingly understands what I'm interested in over time, and therefore grabs more and more of my silo into one place. And at some point, there's already software like Hootsuite that allows me to publish the same paragraph or a similar paragraph in a dozen different social media to programs. So I don't even have to be awake to do it, right? So, yeah. And of course, it says, if I'm going to put it in Twitter, not many people from Twitter are on my time zone. So the thing about Twitter is to make sure you keep reappearing at the top of the stack. So you do it every 2 or 3 hours, and Hootsuite and various other bits and pieces people's are fine, and you can pop off and do that, and it then just puts the same post up in Twitter every 2 or 3 hours. I mean, there's a limit to how many you can do until you start paying for it. You can do that. I mean, it'll do the same for Facebook in different groups as well, etc., etc., etc. So ultimately I'm looking for a better, let's have a multi-social media reader that aggregates all those the other way back, so that I've only got one piece of software to open to say, let me read Dan, let me read Chris, because I've got to go 2 different places. Chris is on his own, and through Hypothesis, those are the 2 ways you meet Chris. Dan you meet through Substack and YouTube, and I bump into Pat occasionally out on the brain, but why should I open up 3 or 4 different browser events, or even 3 or 4 different bits of software?
Or RSS feeds.
Yeah, or RSS. Yeah, almost nobody's using RSS anymore in that context. But yeah,
Chris is the master.
Well, okay, but yes. So, for instance, I opened up. I think it might have been Class to recheck what Class was. And yes, one of the things you can ask Mastodon to do rather was go and get all these RSS feeds, And that's just with whatever reader I'm using for Mastodon. Off the top of my head, I can't remember which one it is. But, and I must, just for validation, find my shelf one day and sit in front of the shelf. I'll probably make sure that I'm doing it at the new National Library here, because it's a very impressive. It's a Y-shaped building. We've got daylight in the middle through the top of the Y, and you've got to book a desk building, so you have to swipe in. You can't just you can wander in, but then you don't get to wander very far. And there's a whole load of stacks, and there's a load of, if you're into the Arabic stuff, there's a load of Arabic. But I don't know what the original museum was like, but the new one is, oddly enough, at the end of one of the metro lines, where there was almost nobody went to that station. Now they do. So if you need a reason, how do you cite a library? You find an unused or very low-level use of an end-of-line metro station, and you stick it there because the ground's going to be cheap. So at least for the first one.
That reminds me too, the Tim mentioning where you find each of us. Going back to Pat's question or criticism about using Obsidian or not Obsidian. And I kind of feel guilty that I don't spend more time in our shared vault. But I think for me, part of that problem is where is my data and how can I share it easily or not?
Mm-hmm.
And as we have gone through almost every other book, I have used a slightly different system just to experiment with some of the stuff because we tend to be experimental people, particularly here. So in Kate Rayworth's book, almost all of my notes are still written in the margins and in the end papers. And it's actually going to take me a little extra time and work to go back and put those into a digital copy in Hypothesis, and then I would export them and then essentially put them into the thing. I think the book before that I was using a Kindle and manually highlighting and hunting and pecking on their crappy typing keyboard that I really hate.
Mm-hmm.
For this book, I've got a Books like paper that I can write on, and I'm physically writing both in the book and in a separate. I can do a 2-screen thing, and I haven't even really begun to play with how am I going to get that data out. Although it's got some reasonable.
Was that a remarkable?
It's like Remarkable, but it's a different. It's a Chinese company that I think they've probably got a better handwriting and handwriting recognition UI. I think Remarkable is kind of the more commonly purchased, but I think the technology in this, because it's a full Android tablet with actually a color e-ink screen. So I've been experimenting with that, but my level of experimentation has mostly been the reading and writing piece, and I haven't really played a lot with the handwriting to text conversion or taking. And I'm gonna, I think, wait until the book is done to export it all. But that also means then it's harder to have it in a spot that I can drag it and drop it and do that work to put it into Obsidian.
Mm-hmm.
To kind of share it.
Yeah.
That was another one with Class. It's there to highlight and comment on web pages. That's its primary function. And that works really well, but it also gives you the ability to take all of your highlights and all of your comments over all of the pages and drop it into a file. And there's a number of file formats. But if you do it one page at a time, that does a very nice, properly formatted Obsidian markdown page. Right? It's a markdown page, but it's very transparent to Obsidian. If you do it all by quirk of fate, it doesn't give you a markdown file, it gives you a zip file. But a zip file isn't a zip file, it's just a markdown file called zip. So all you need to do is change the last 3 letters to 2. But it's a file. So you don't get the granularity. And the other thing it mucks up is all of the YAML metadata type front piece stuff that the normal one gets you. And so part of the nicety is lost. So you have to do it page by page. It's not too bad. And then it's like, okay, so I've done it once. Now, and of course, we've had the conversation about, even with Lumen going back to a source to do another reread because it's a different project or a different aspect or a different bias, etc., that he wants to abstract. And it's like, okay, now abstract the stuff you haven't abstracted before. Won't do that either. So you end up with, yes, but I can collect it by 4 different colors. So you could go yellow first pass, blue second pass, pink third, or whatever, if you wanted to. So you've got some mechanism. So it's not quite so bad. It's just not automatic, right? But they're a small teams and they're quite receptive to doing that sort of stuff. But going back slightly differently, but same sort of problem as I had a moment ago, they don't have their own run Obsidian style forum. They run it through Slack, as does Elicit. And Elicit is sort of like a Research Rabbit similar thing that does science papers. So you could search for science papers by keywords and get all the abstracts and get a database built into a collection, rather like Zotero will take very quickly. But again, they don't talk to you except via Slack. And why would I need Slack? Except to talk to people about software that I use. So I've now got a double-ended Slack account with those 2 people as well. And it's like, now I'm getting into using Slack. I want to use it to talk to other people too. But I don't want to have yet another place to go and, somebody messaged me, and I really hate turning on a normal notifications that allows Facebook and Gmail and etc. to say, oh, you've got an email, because my phone and or laptop would never stop pinging.
Yeah. I've got a there's some book publishing software people in, I don't know even where, somewhere in Europe, who use this app called Mattermost, which I have like an account on that just to talk to them occasionally, and usually all they do is they send out group texts, which is just maddening.
Well, Mattermost essentially is an open source, own your own platform version of some of the other chat software like Discord.
Yeah.
So it's to me, I think that's the hardest part of a lot of this is we had these methods in pen and paper, and it was harder because you had to write a letter to somebody to share your knowledge with them and send things back and forth through the post. And the computer upended a lot of that and made a lot of things easier, but we're still missing simple, easy layers of user interface for things like, Scrintl will let you take little bits of knowledge and move them around on a deck and kind of create a little mini map in an easy way that a lot of softwares don't. Or things like Twitter make it easier for you to put a quick little note out that other people can then interact with and have a conversation with. But all these things and spaces are independently owned or siloed off from each other, and don't have an easy way of, it takes me extra work. All the notes I take in a hypothesis are mirrored on my own website, and my own website has the ability to then publish out and interact with other things or talk to other platforms. But it's not easy and it's not ubiquitous, and that makes the whole process that much additional work on top of, if you want to frame it this way, the reason Niklas Luhmann was so prolific and productive with his note-taking system is that he didn't interact with anything outside of it.
Right.
And he was not distracted by the 27 tools that were alternate versions of the thing he was doing and using. And so by ignoring it all and just doing the one thing, he was way more productive because he didn't have to tinker with, okay, now how do I get all this data from these index cards into Obsidian and Skrintl and Twitter so that I can interact with other people.
But that's the problem. The reason at the beginning of tonight's conversation that I referenced that Obsidian AI tool was, recently I found ways now in Obsidian to import all my highlights. So I have highlights from 100+ books, but they're just there, right? And the value, again, what we find of value, I think a lot of these tools is exploring the connections that we have built.
Right.
And that's the problem with bringing all this stuff in. There's no connections to anything I can search, but the AI stuff has given me some ways to explore what I have now, and then I can tag it or link it. So there's this building or generative process, but it requires, like you say, several tools to get to. But again, that's the thing that I think is always this issue. Is it about storage and search, or is it about building the connection to yourself? Because in that discovery, I think there's some cognitive advantage.
Or this is where a link of communication between all those tools. So my tool can talk to your tool, and we can have a virtual conversation between my notes and your notes. Right now, we're all reading and writing things, and I think most of it happens as conversations here. Dan can mention abortion as a thing with an area he's interested in, and that sparks me to remember, Benjamin Franklin had this thing as well at that time or an earlier time.
But
and then that makes that connection requires the conversation.
Me trying to read something into Pat's comment that kind of started from this conversation was that what he was looking for, that we were no longer creating?
I think that was a little bit of frustration about that. Yeah, that we were not moving that ball forward. I think about Franklin. I was going to put it in the chat, but the other interesting side of Franklin, right, was his patronage of the postal service, right, and his expansion of that, and his and making these postal riders carry even newspapers at incredibly cheap rates, right? So you could send newspapers to the frontier, affordably, and that spread, kind of this network of knowledge. There was a term that was used apparently recently that Walter Kern, I think, picked up in his talk with Matt Taibbi this week on America This Week, called cognitive infrastructure. And they were sort of at the beginning of this week's episode, they were sort of talking about what could cognitive infrastructure possibly mean? And it's like, well, it's obvious, right? Because it's what we've just been talking about, right? It's the stack of tweets, right? Or the stack of Zuckerman's threads, right? Or the stack of Readwise highlights, right? That are the substrate, are basically what, in the words of Jaron Lanier, right? That they're if you're not paying, you're the product, right? So that's the product, right? And so we're producing this this volume of cognitive infrastructure that actually has risen, that has risen, not necessarily in quality, but at least in quantity, to a sufficient level that it is actually a foundation for, way to go, Chris. Cognitive infrastructure. That is what these fortunes are being based on. I mean, I might actually, once I get back from the camping trip, I might actually revisit, You Are Not a Gadget or Who Owns the Future or something like that, one of those Jaron Lanier books, because I think they're really kind of relevant. Oh, wow. Cool.
There's a cognitive infrastructure.
Chris, what is the book that you turned forward there in your stack?
It's Bob Moses' The Power Broker, which has been called out as being one of the most commonly shelved behind talking heads on TV books of the pandemic. Like, if you don't have a copy of this book on a shelf behind you, you just are not a legitimate person to be talking on the news.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. It was kind of Crystalline Sager who sort of, who sort of jumped on that for the background of their, once they left the Hill, right? They started saying, okay, these are our foundational books, and manufacturing, manufacturing consent was a big early one there, although I think they've moved on from that.
My favorite was always, I saw thousands of people say, oh my God, this woman has the library I want. And it was invariably, it was a picture of Zanny Minton Beddoes being interviewed on TV. And she is supremely smart and incredibly well read. But as the head of book reviews for The Economist, like, that entire library behind her is essentially free books that every publisher on the planet wants her to read and write about for The Economist, because that's going to sell books.
Right.
Now, that isn't to say that I don't doubt for a second Zanny Minton Beddoes has read the vast majority of those books in that layer behind her and those things.
Yeah.
But it also means she's incredibly privileged that they've all shown up for free rather than, yes, I paid for all of these, right, which is a whole other ball of wax.
Yeah. Well, it's crazy because I remember, when COVID hit, and people actually did start doing Zoom news, guest spots on news shows. I remember there was one, and I don't know which show it was on, and I don't know who the guest was, but behind him on the top of his shelves was the 3-volume hardcover set of The Three Body Problem, the science fiction series, and I saw it and I commented on it in the YouTube comments, and I got a response actually from the person saying, "Oh yeah, that's one of my favorites."
Well, I regularly found myself, we would be watching the news and I would hit the pause button on the high def blow up of the bookshelf, and I would walk up and be like, okay, so I need to be reading this and this, and I would be I would be judging people based on the overlap of their collection and my collection.
I did notice that when he was doing a podcast with somebody recently that RFK Jr. has this book.
I can't make it out from this distance. What is it? Oh.
It's just a series. It's a coffee table book. It's just a series of photographs of the Earth from, aerial photographs.
Yeah.
Of all different parts of the world. Beautiful thing. But, it struck me, and I was looking at his bookshelf because he often does his interviews, and he must live somewhere in the LA suburbs, right? And
I wonder how
he does them in front of his bookshelf, but it's like the type of bookshelf my parents, it's the types of books that are on my parents' shelves.
Having T.H. White on your shelf, there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah,
either T.H. White.
Right. Although I do remember when I was a kid, my dad had a copy. It wasn't a very thick copy; it was only about this thick, of the Warren Report on his shelf. Which interested me. I do remember though, he also one day, he was a high school teacher, and he and another high school teacher got their hands on an 8mm print of the Zapruder film, and we set up the projector and watched it, when I was little.
Yeah, I sort of half wonder with partly because of a librarian and partly because of a reader. It's the thing that I do whenever I go out to dinner for somebody's house is
look at their book.
I had to take the longest possible route to go past the bookshelf to see what's on it. But it's also elements of do I expect to see a copy of Mouse on everybody's shelf, or or is it something as simple as I want to see a well-thumbed copy of Motorcycle Maintenance or whatever. But I was in part, before you and Chris had your backwards and forwards there, it was, and talking about the Economist book editor with all the free books, read or not read, and all the rest of it. I keep thinking of two things. There are two videos come, two interviews that are very book-based. One is with Christopher Hitchens, where he walks you through the flat and past all the stacks. And some of the stacks are literally piles of books on the floor because he hasn't got enough shelf. And this is before he's really sick. So I think it's still when he's got a bit of hair, pre-chemo. And the other one is Umberto Eco walk through the library. And the interviewer, I can't even remember where it's actually done properly in English or whether it's a translation. But the interviewer asks, so how many of these have you read? And he says, I've got 30,000 to read. I need another lifetime, or worse to that effect. And it's like, I'm doing a quick librarian count in terms of, okay, that shelf looks like it's double-sided. That one looks like it's up against the wall, because a lot of them are very tall, and he's quite a short guy. So the camera's focused in on it. It's difficult to say, can he read all their books? And or is there a wall behind that book, or is there another row of shelf, etc.? And it's like, there must be about 70,000 book spaces in this set of shelves. So the fact that he hasn't read 30 of them is fine by me, in that sense. And,
there you go, John. All right. That's perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I wanted to say something controversial too in our early part of the book. I presuppose some of you, like me, have read most or a chunk of the books that he references in his short books I consulted section. And I think somebody mentioned it the last time we met about I was some sense of the book being kind of a little dull and boring and derivative. And I being a fan of Winchester and the topics that he's talking about here, I was probably over enamored. And I think what I find interesting about Winchester is usually he's writing about things I don't know well about. So it's way more interesting. But this I find to be almost deadly dull, basic. It's generally good writing. But I find myself less engaged with it because I've read most of these other books or big chunks thereof. So he's not saying anything new or interesting to me. And he doesn't thus far, and I'm a couple chapters ahead, I think. He doesn't have any kind of broad thesis that's tying all this stuff together other than just the title itself. So for me, it almost reads as if it's that old phrase, he's dumping a Zettelkasten out into a book. But there's no great linkages between the topics go from one to another, but there's no great thesis he's building up here in talking about these things. And so I thought I would send a personal apology to anybody I forced to read this.
I'm getting to like it better. I was kind of not impressed with the first with the introduction and stuff. But I like I'm actually liking some of the little stories. I liked the story of Earthrise. That added a little bit of detail.
I mean, I think the way it's reading to me is it's a really great set of blog posts on common topics that have been pushed together.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not, doesn't have an overarching kind of bigger theme or thesis that's like, this is going to be the life-changing thing.
I think partially it's, and actually that does strike me because, I've also been I've been listening to, what's her name? Jill Lepore has a book, has an audio book. I don't know if it's even a print book called Who Killed Truth that she narrates herself, that I think is from a series of, blog posts or articles, not very heavily edited. And it does sound like, Heather Cox Richardson is coming out with a book based on, letters from an American. And it does strike me that a lot, that Substack probably is enabling this model, right? That people are going to write short pieces. I'm reminded of, who was it? Roberto Colasso, The Marriage of Cadmus and Harmony, was this crazy but super evocative kind of meditation on kind of Western culture that came out in the 80s. And then I think he wrote something after that I didn't read, but I remember finding that just it was a piece, and it had a point of view and an argument that I think is one of those things that we don't see a lot in a lot of these things.
Yeah, I think for me this is a book about lots of bits of pieces of knowledge are related, and they stand together as a collection. But I want the higher end curators at the Huntington to not only put the pieces together and curate and collect them, but also to give me a bigger story with a bigger thesis at the end, or something that's going to change my perspective. I want, I want maps of time to dramatically change my viewpoint of the world and how I see it. Or I want, Colin Woodard's American Nations, here's the history that you already know, but I'm going to reframe it in such a dramatically different way. Here's a new way of looking at the world. And I don't feel like I'm getting a new way of looking at the world from this. There's a lot of interesting stuff here, and a lot of interesting stuff the average reader that this book is targeted towards, because it's a mass market,
but
it's not going to change my viewpoint of power and government the way Bob Caro did.
Or even that, and there are people who have written, Dawn of Everything was a little bit chaotic because it was, all mashed together without, the ability to go back and edit it or break it into a couple of volumes, which it probably should have been. But Debt was pretty freestanding and made I think a fairly complete argument. I mean, it certainly wasn't. I mean, which is, it's interesting because it does sort of. I guess we're probably out of time, but it does sort of fascinate me that kind of question of, well, if you're doing the one thing, right? If you're doing the collecting information in Obsidian, or writing short essays, blog posts about pieces of things you're finding out in Substack, in what ways can you, not so much legitimately, but in a well-crafted way, kind of turn those into something that's meaningful.
it may be part of the broader sense making thing that you're going out and you're collecting the small tiny things, and you may be writing short essays, but then once you've got 20 or 30 essays and you know the space fairly well and you're able to make a greater sense out of it, how can you take what you've learned and consumed and then created and help make it easier for the next person who comes along to not have to do all that work you've done to come to that level of insight.
Mm-hmm.
But here you can go back, and if you want to, you can see how I built up this thing.
Well, and maybe part of it is not, maybe part of it is that, and the thing that's missing is the killing your babies part, right? That, that not everything that you accumulate and not all these pieces are going to be able to be slotted in, that you're forcing it if you do that, and you have to be a little bit more selective, and you have to have more to say than these little, kind of individual moments of, points that you made along the way, that somehow they need to, the whole needs to kind of be bigger than some of the parts.
I mean, that's even the tough part about explaining to someone what a Zettelkasten is easy. I can pick up this drawer on the floor and say it's this, but it's much harder to explain the emergent things that come out of using it for several weeks or months.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's not something you even want, of that emergence of ideas flowing together and mixing together, and some, at least once a month I have some weird, bizarre, crazy insight that pops out of what I've been doing that I never would have come up with, on my own, just from sheer memory.
Yeah.
But explaining that is stupidly hard, and most people either don't get it, don't want to get it, or even if they did, they don't need it.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting. It'll be interesting to see kind of where that goes, because I don't know. I've mentioned him several times. I do follow Taibbi on Substack, and he has started this thing where, he began kind of with talking about stories with Kern at the end of his America This Week, and this week they did the Rocking Horse winner. So it was kind of interesting. We talked about Lawrence earlier, but he's also got this thing that I think he calls the writer's life or something like that, where he's blogging about his life as a writer in a kind of a personal way that may end up, I don't know what it's going to end up being, but it's but it's interesting that he's kind of I guess the reason I mention it is that he's following this trajectory that is meaningful to him and may lead to an endpoint that that kind of adds something. So for for 2 weeks from now, shall we just read a couple of chapters, or shall we read? I mean, there are just 3 more. Shall we just finish it?
Sure.
In 2 weeks? Okay. And then have we picked the next one?
Yeah, I think the next 3 chapters actually are about as much as we read for these 2 chapters.
Okay.
If I'm not horribly off.
Okay. So then that will be, so I'll put a little announcement up in the,
maybe a tiny bit more,
the community notes, in case, Pat or anybody else wants to join. That on the, whatever date that will be, 14th or the 22nd, we'll finish the book. So for the next book, we had talked about a couple of things. But I think it was the big myth, wasn't it? That people were most interested in last time we talked, a couple of weeks ago.
Big myth.
Yeah, Oreskes and Conway. How American business taught us to loathe the government and love the free market.
Yeah. I would be happy with that.
Yeah.
Pat was big on that as well.
Yeah,
That's idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm good.
We go with that. Okay, I will put that in the announcement then. I think I actually did grab the Kindle version of it 2 weeks ago. I haven't started reading it yet.
I'll mention it because it just came out, and it's follows on some of the themes we have talked about, and maybe people are just interested in reading it separately. But Rothstein and his daughter, he wrote an earlier book, was it on redlining?
Mm-hmm.
But this just came out a couple weeks ago, and they're about to start touring for it. But it's how to challenge segregation.
Cool.
But it's more, I think it's more, I just skimmed the beginning of it. It's more about solutions for how to fix some of the inequality and social inequity problems that we focused on in past books.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll throw that out there as an idea. I'm going to read it sometime in the next 2 months.
Okay.
In any case, but
Cool.
it's
Thanks.
in the space of stuff we've all been reading and talking about for the last 6 months or a year.
Okay. Cool. Great. Then looks like I've got a lot. Go ahead, Tim.
The only thing that I was going to re-mention, although I put it into the Obsidian notes into the general chat, this current book and chapter 2/3, the other thing that jumped out to me was the Firestorm episode of the Waltons with the book burning.
Yeah.
Again. And by quirk of fate, it made me get off my arse and go look, see if there's a copy, and there is. It's a very very bad copy on YouTube where somebody ends up by coughing over the fact that they're copying it off a television. But when you look through it, it's season 5, episode 5 of the Firestorm book burning piece. There is the episode isn't YouTube, it's actually a video on Facebook. And then there's a YouTube of one of the actors talking about that episode that's really a back of house blooper reel, talk about the program rather than the actual book burning per se. But it's one of 2 episodes that I always remember. And the other one is the episode that isn't the episode per se, it's the blooper. Back in the late 70s, there's the blooper programs were showing once a year or twice a year a collection of bloopers. And there's a blooper with John Boyd talks to one of the middle sisters and about the younger brother. And she's dragged him up a tree, or she's climbed a tree with him, won't let him down. And the blooper is he fluffs his line and says, "Stop hanging on to whatever the name of the younger brother is up in that tree by his balls and let him go." It was just okay. What was the real sentence? Because they didn't. I don't remember what they showed as the anti-blooper, as it were. You could just imagine. This was obviously when John Boyd was the real goody 2 shoes and all that.
Right. He would never say such a thing.
He would never say such a yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
He would never say such a thing. Unlike what appears to be the only other famous role that I know him from, where he's the bad guy at the CIA in the Americans.
Right. Yeah. He played a pretty good bad guy because you didn't expect it of him.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we should probably go.
See you all in 2 weeks.
Yep, 2 weeks. Take care.
Don't get lost.
Yeah, I'll try.